But anyway, more of that later. So I'm going back to 1985 when I was at Victoria Wine and Grants at St James's, and we were bottling wines in Guildford, and tankers of wines were coming in, and we had all sorts of really interesting wines. I think, dare say, a bit ahead of our time in those days, because we had a really nice white wine from Austria. And I can't remember, the region, in my mind, it's called a Frankensteiner, but I guess it wouldn't have been called that because, you know, that just is just a monster that makes me think of that. There must be a anyway, something that sounds a bit like Frankenstein. And we had two 20,000 litre tanks coming in, and they were just about to be unloaded the day the headlines in 1985 sort of antifreeze scandal. I don't know if you remember that. Back in 1985, the great Austrian antifreeze scandal hit, and basically some various people had been adulterating Austrian wine with diethylene glycol, which is a component part of antifreeze. And the reason why they were doing it was because back then, and for a bit longer, I know this because we were buying sort of lots and lots of German wines. It was all Liefraumilch and Hock and Piesporter and Niersteiner Gutes Domtar, and they were all dirt cheap, and they were the biggest. I mean, German wines. I think the French wines had about 40% of the market. Germany came a close second with 30% of the market because we were drinking. That's just in the UK. We were drinking lots of these sweet white wines, and of course, like any commodity, producers are under pressure to reduce the price because the nasty retailers are always putting pressure on them to get cheaper and cheaper, or sort of squeezing margins. So and you've got these we saw last week, we had a look at that Noble Rot. We saw the grapes with Noble Rot on it for the Morillon. Well, if you go to Germany and you have a Spätlese or an Auslese, they've got a similar sort of thing going on there. That's the rotten grapes enhance the sweetness and make it quite an expensive wine. If you take a cheap wine and add diethylene glycol to it, it actually has a lot of, it turns the wine really fat and sweet. And it's a cheap way of sort of trying to disguise something. The downside was you potentially die from it, and that's what happened. So that hit the headlines. They did have fatalities from people who were drinking this Austrian wine that had been diluted, and it had been diluted. Austrian wine had been diluted with this stuff to be sent into Germany to blend with cheap German wines. So it was a complete and utter mess. And we had 40,000 litres of the stuff just arrived, which we tested, and it had zero. It didn't have anything, but it killed the Austrian market stone dead in 1985, and it took decades to recover. We managed to blend it away. So instead of selling it as an Austrian wine, we blended it with some bit of Italian, bit of French, and a bit of German, and called it a European blend. And it hit the Victoria wine shops, and it sold very successfully. Actually, it was very nice, and it was perfectly legal, and no contamination whatsoever. But we managed to sort of avert a disaster of chucking away 40,000 litres.